Sometime after the events of A Link to the Past, Link finds himself caught up in a bad storm while sailing back home to Hyrule. Unfortunately, the storm gets the better of Link and he is washed up on the shores of Koholint Island. Something noteworthy about this installment of the Zelda franchise is Link's Awakening does not open with a story crawl. Zelda 1 and 2 opened with poorly translated text, and A Link to the Past contained an extensive backstory, giving the player a ton of information on the history of Hyrule, the Triforce, and the antagonist Ganon. But not in Link's Awakening. There is a noticeable shift in the way story elements are presented and revealed to the player, and it helps this 1993 release be all the more approachable. Of course, most now know the plot to Link's Awakening, and the title isn't exactly subtle if you know what I mean, but it is refreshing nonetheless. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is the fourth installment of the Zelda franchise, originally released on the Game Boy in 1993, with a Game Boy Color update released in 1998. The game has been well received too. IGN even gave the DX version a perfect 10 out of 10, declaring it a masterpiece. Even to this day, a subset of the Zelda community finds Link's Awakening to be a superior title to its 16-bit brother. On the surface, Link's Awakening follows a similar formula laid out by the previous games. Link starts the game with an item or two, must travel the overworld looking for dungeons, and then conquer the dungeons to earn trinkets necessary to finish the game. It is a tried and true formula that doesn't really need tweaking, but if Link's Awakening doesn't stray far from the norm, why is it so beloved? Let's take a look. After the opening cutscene, Link awakens in the home of Marin and her father Terran. It seems Link is suffering from some mild amnesia and doesn't understand where he is. Then the player is given an item and told where to go next. A first-time player might choose to explore the surrounding buildings or do as instructed and follow the path to the beach. In either case, the player is shown numerous landmarks which will be of importance later on in the adventure. In any case, after making it to the beach and acquiring the sword, another plot device is introduced, a mysterious owl. This guy serves two purposes. First, he often directs Link where to go next. Not an exact location, mind you, just a general area. Second, he reveals Link must awaken the windfish to leave Koholint Island. The player doesn't yet know how to wake the windfish, or what a windfish is for that matter, but that is sort of the point. Link's Awakening doesn't open with a plot dump and then send the player off. Instead, a player is forced to keep going to slowly unravel the mystery. It offers a great incentive to keep moving forward, and I appreciate this change quite a bit. Link's Awakening also changes up the overworld formula quite a bit. The player cannot simply enter a dungeon. Instead, dungeons are usually unlocked with a key. This changes the overworld from a space the player must travel into something more akin to a dungeon itself. The overworld has a deliberate feel to it. Paths are laid out in a way to show a player something they'll need to contend with later. A player is blocked from accessing areas not needed for the task at hand, but is still given a glimpse of the larger world, giving the player a taste of what they can explore once an item is obtained to overcome an obstacle. Some might find this makes The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening too hand-holdy and long for the days of vague clues and little guidance. However, Link's Awakening is still quite clever. The player still has to notice things, for example, like a random toadstool in the mysterious woods. This can be taken to Tracy, the witch, who makes a magic powder. This powder is needed to clear out a raccoon, who created a loop in the overworld, preventing player progress. Solving this puzzle reveals the tail key, and thus the first dungeon. But this isn't the only way a player might unlock a dungeon. After clearing the first, the player is greeted by two children in panic who advise something has happened to Bow Wow. A player doesn't need to wander about and discover this, but rather a natural choke point in the overworld map forces the player to confront this fact. The player's next goal is not to find the next dungeon key, but rather rescue a dog. Thanks to the feather received in the first dungeon, the player can jump over pits and explore a new part of Koholint Island. With the item and a new area, the player has the clues necessary to retrieve the dog, who just so happens to be the key needed for the next dungeon. This doesn't diminish the exploration aspect of the adventure though. By going off the beaten path and exploring all of the newly accessible areas with each new item, the player will absolutely run into new NPCs or other locations not currently needed. For example, the player will find Mr. Right, who is not initially helpful. However, Link's Awakening does something previous Zeldas hadn't. The overworld map is now labeled. A player can move a cursor over any block of land already accessed, and each will have text. quest. This means later on, when another character requests Link make a delivery to Mr. Right, one doesn't need to wander all over the place trying to figure out where they ran into that guy. Instead, they can pull up their map, hover the cursor over each building, and pinpoint the exact location without wasting a lot of time. Speaking of the map, the player can clearly see what locations have been unexplored. This is a critical piece of information, and again offers players clues as to where they might want to visit as the mystery of Koholint Island slowly reveals itself. It is touches like this which make Link's Awakening far less grindy when it comes to overworld exploration. Another thing the overworld does is spend quite a bit of real estate on puzzles. At one point, the player is asked to find the 5 golden leaves at a castle. Thankfully, the castle and the area surrounding it are not overly huge, meaning there is a relatively small area to explore to complete this fetch quest. That doesn't make it simple though. For those loving obscure tasks with few hints, this should satisfy. The player can clearly see a boss character, but determining how to open the door is not obvious. One will have to just figure it out. Grumble, grumble. Some of these overworld areas are less than satisfactory though. The signpost maze isn't really a maze at all. A player just needs to read a sign and then follow the arrow over and over and over. Same goes for Pothole Field, tasking the player with slashing down trees to reveal the path forward. Neither are thought-provoking. Another underdeveloped moment occurs when Link is suddenly haunted by a ghost. After an escort mission to his old house and finally a grave, Link's reward is just a seashell, an item not actually necessary for progression. Again, it is a strange moment, and I'm not sure it adds anything to the game. Perhaps it's an apology for Zelda 1, where knowing which grave to visit was a painful process. Who knows? And of course, there is the infamous trade sequence. But first, there is a crane game in the village with some goodies along with a Yoshi doll, which is not on the conveyor belt. It stands out and is an obvious target. This kicks off a massive trade sequence, which lasts most of the game. At a few points, the player has to keep an eye out for trades in order to not get stuck. Generally speaking, this is intuitive enough. Each of the NPCs alerts the player to their desires or tendencies right away, meaning one doesn't have to keep visiting them over and over to see if they say something different. In fact, sometimes the NPC meets the player at a designated location to kick off a trade, meaning the player is spending less time wandering and more time getting a move on. It isn't perfect, however. A player has to dive under a bridge, for example, which would only be obvious to a player who knew about the secret in A Link to the Past. Or maybe this lone statue offers a clue. Speaking of clues, Koholint Island is filled with phone booths. This is an upgrade of sorts over the fortune teller in A Link to the Past. Scattered about Koholint Island are phone booths, which will offer clues or guidance to the player. Now, I never visited the fortune teller in A Link to the Past because it cost rupees, but help in Link's Awakening is free. On this recorded playthrough, I visited the phone booth as often as possible just to see what the old man would say. Sometimes the advice was vague, repeating the same general instructions the owl previously stated. Other times, more direct, and other times, just plain wrong. For example, at one point the old man told me to visit a frog in the signpost maze. After wasting minutes following the darn thing, I couldn't receive the item the frog offers. The player actually needs to obtain the ocarina before the frog will teach Link a song. So, how did I miss the ocarina? Well, like the previous game, Link's Awakening expects the player to revisit past areas once they obtain new abilities. As I forgot the location of every boulder I could now lift with the power bracelet, I forgot about this little building in Mabe Village, which contains the prize. It would have been nice if the old man told me to find the musical instrument in the Mabe Village at this point, rather than directing me to the frog in the maze. Both the ocarina and the songs learned are required to beat the game. This, of course, brings up the great debate. Where is the line between good design and hand-holding? Too much hand-holding reduces player engagement by reducing the amount of thought and reason needed to complete a task. Too little guidance and the player wastes time wandering around not accomplishing anything. I feel as though Link's Awakening gets it about right. A player is required to notice things, like those boulders, but is also given clues about what to do next and where to go. A player is then challenged to use the clues, such as the guidance from the owl, strange dialogue with NPCs, and new items found and obtained to solve a puzzle and unlock the way forward. It is a good system, and I rarely felt Link's Awakening was pandering me, nor trolling me. The other half of any Zelda game is, of course, the dungeons. The main goal of Link's Awakening is to obtain the 8 instruments offered as a reward for defeating the 8 nightmares in the 8 dungeons. The 8 instruments are needed to wake the windfish sleeping in the giant egg. Unlike The Legend of Zelda or A Link to the Past, I'm not sure if the player is able to sequence break the dungeon order at all. This could certainly be a point of contention for some, creating a more linear player experience and further venturing away from the non-linear style offered in the original game. However, it is the dungeons where the designers took the limitations of the Game Boy hardware and used it to their advantage. For example, the shield is no longer a passive mechanic, but now an active one. The player has to use the shield. It is not automatic. In the first dungeon, this is required to flip over enemies who are initially immune to the sword. This is not unlike the hammer item in A Link to the Past, but the designers saved an item slot. A major addition to the formula is the function of the compass. Not only does it show where the boss is on the map, but also treasure chests. A great way to let a player know what they might have missed, making backtracking far less tedious. But most importantly, if the player enters a room where a key is located, a chime will play. I absolutely love this feature, as I immediately know if defeating all of the enemies in a room is worth my time, or if I can just cruise on past. It is a subtle touch, but a creature comfort I desperately missed when playing prior games. The next evolution to the formula are the crystal switches. The biggest change is they can now be walked across, something not possible in the past game. This opens up new pathways and further complicates their use. And this is probably my favorite change in Link's Awakening. The dungeons actually challenged me to think. In Catfish's Maw, the player encounters a reoccurring skeleton mini-boss, but as the dungeons become less linear, the player might actually stumble upon an empty room with nothing happening. Later, when they finally encounter the skeleton in a room with the same floor pattern, they'll be clued in. They'll have to revisit that empty room previously found. Again, Link's Awakening walks a fine line between becoming too grindy with backtracking and being genuinely clever with requiring a player to memorize the entire dungeon and learn how everything interacts. A perfect example of this is the 7th dungeon, Eagle's Tower. This is a multi-layered dungeon with multiple stories, and the player is required to manipulate the crystal switches, drop down holes in the floor, and then travel up a different set of stairs in order to reach all of the rooms on the 2nd level. Not only this, the player needs to throw this ball at 4 different pillars to collapse a portion of the tower, which opens up a path to the boss. There are multiple ways to solve this puzzle, and throwing the ball over a pit and then venturing back down and then up the tower is required to ultimately knock them all down. Even on my second playthrough for this video, it still took me a whopping 40 minutes to ultimately solve this puzzle. It is that freaking good. The final dungeon, Turtle Rock, is also a brainbuster. This dungeon really forces the player to fully understand the layout of the dungeon and how different warps interact with each other. It is filled with strategically placed one-way areas where a player can't simply retreat to a past screen and go a different way. This means if a player messes up and goes the wrong way, they'll be forced through a laborious route to get back to the same screen and go a different way. Again, Link's Awakening dances on the line between being tedious or dishing out a fair punishment for sloppy exploring. And again, despite doing this twice in the span of a couple of days, it took me over 50 minutes to finally locate the nightmare key and take on the boss. So yeah, Link's Awakening does follow the standard find a key, unlock a door to find the next key, and unlock the next door formula, which has been a staple of the franchise. But instead of having a big key and a big chest, there is a nightmare key, which needs to be found to unlock the room containing the boss. Even better, the dungeons contain sub-bosses, and defeating them will open up a warp point. What is awesome about this is the warp point is usually just a few rooms away from the nightmare room, meaning if the player dies, they don't have to backtrack through the entire dungeon to get back to the boss. Instead, they can walk into the warp point and save a ton of time. I love touches like this, which allow the player to regain progress instead of waste time retreading old ground. Finally, I want to talk about the bombs. A common complaint I hear about A Link to the Past is how bombable walls were always clearly marked for the player, meaning the only thing preventing a player from opening the path was bomb management. This is in stark contrast to the first Zelda game, where walls weren't marked at all. Generally speaking, neither really bothered me. In the first game, I simply never ran out of bombs thanks to the map trap system and being frugal. On the flip side, I rarely felt like bombing a wall was a great puzzle, so I didn't miss the exploration aspect when I played A Link to the Past. However, Link's Awakening actually expands on this concept. Now, at first, bombable walls are usually marked. However, as the adventure unfolds, more and more walls are not marked. There might be an arrow on the floor, or perhaps the player catches a glimpse of one side of a wall on the screen but not the other. But on the last few dungeons, the players offered almost no visual guidance. Instead, that intuition from the first game, combined with using the sword to find hollow spots in the wall, is the only guidance the player has to clear later puzzles in the game. On my first go-around, the 8th dungeon drove me mad as I was out of keys with no clear path forward. It turned out I had to get over my fear of wasting bombs to finally overcome this dungeon. Catfish's Maw is also funny in that the player will likely struggle to find the nightmare key because the room it is found in is not on the map. Link's Awakening can be devilishly tricky sometimes, and this is something I really appreciate when playing a game multiple times. The final element I want to talk about is the characters. When playing A Link to the Past for the first time, I was rarely invested in many of the characters. Rescuing the princess in the opening moments of the game was pretty cool, and I liked how I kept visiting the village elder for guidance, but outside of them, I was sort of puzzled when the closing credits rolled and I was given an update on the cast of Hyrule. I felt no attachment to them and didn't really care about how their lives ended up once the Seal of the Wise Men was closed. Link's Awakening does a much better job introducing characters, giving them a personality, and forcing the player to interact with them a few times, helping the player to actually remember they exist. And of course, Link and Marin share a few moments, and it is quite obvious she has a crush on Link. They even share a moment on the beach, and Link later saves her life. There is just a layer of depth, warmth, and wit to the writing that is lacking in A Link to the Past, and I find it makes Koholint Island a more memorable place than Hyrule. If I were to make a comparison between A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, the design of the overworld, the puzzles found in the dungeons, and character development is where I would start my analysis and try and reach a conclusion. Now, being a handheld game on 8-bit hardware, Link's Awakening doesn't look or sound as good as its 16-bit brother. Most will likely prefer to play this with the full color palette afforded with the DX version of the game as well, but for technical reasons, I'm presenting Link's Awakening with just 4 shades of green, though I do find the game to be rather attractive even with this limitation. The artists did an awesome job using distinct patterns to give each area in Koholint Island a distinct appearance, despite sharing the same colors. Even with the low resolution and 8-bit hardware, the deserts, mountains, beaches, and prairies look nothing alike, and I never found myself getting bored with the set pieces. Link's Awakening even manages to have darkened rooms, which get brighter after lighting lantern pots. Flickering is used on shadows to simulate transparencies. It is very ambitious, and while the 4-color palette may seem dated to some, I still find the actual tile and sprite work to be top-notch. I am also quite fond of the soundtrack. Again, this just might be my nostalgia for 8-bit chiptunes, but I do like the sound design. The classic Zelda track is present in much of the overworld, and it sounds as awesome as ever. But I really dig the remix tune when in the Telltale Mountain Range. It has this epic, fast-paced beginning and feels really exciting, which is fitting as this is the last place the player unlocks in the overworld. There is an energy to it, and it is obvious the exciting conclusion is right around the corner. The 2 villages each have simple tracks, catchy but somehow relaxed, appropriate for areas completely void of any danger. The dungeon music deserves a mention as well, as there are multiple tracks rather than one. These generally use some of the harsher sounds available with the sound hardware, making them feel dangerous. And I don't even know how to explain the mysterious woods, but there is a drum line throughout that is completely genre-breaking, and really helps Link's Awakening feel like something more than a fantasy dungeon crawler. Of course, Link's Awakening is not perfect. I absolutely hate the Guardian Acorn and Piece of Power. These two items will occasionally be dropped by defeated enemies. The Guardian Acorn will temporarily reduce the damage Link takes by half, and the Piece of Power temporarily increases the strength of Link's sword. The issue isn't the items, but rather they each have their own jingle which takes over the background music. The tracks are short, meaning they quickly loop, and are weak compositionally. Worse yet, they completely ruin the atmosphere of the dungeons. I'm sorry, but I don't want to hear some peppy song while I'm dungeon crawling. It's obnoxious. So obnoxious, in fact, I would avoid them when possible, because I don't want to hear the music. However, the reason they actually exist is worth exploring further. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening does not have any healing items. There are no potions to buy, no healing magic, and no jars to store fairies. Granted, the final 3 dungeons do contain an item called Secret Medicine. This is used automatically once a player runs out of health, but it is single use and also rare. The lack of healing actually makes Link's Awakening somewhat harder than A Link to the Past. On my recorded run, I actually never died. Ever. It was just too easy to buy potions, net some fairies, and be assured a death-free path through each dungeon. This luxury is not afforded to players in Link's Awakening, making each enemy encounter, sub-boss battle, and nightmare battle that much more intense. There is no crutch to rescue the player after a mistake, until the last couple of dungeons anyway. And of course, Link has fewer hearts. This is probably just a symptom of the reduced Game Boy resolution, but the player taps out at 14, rather than the 16 found in the original Zelda, or 20 available in A Link to the Past. Now, I'm not saying Link's Awakening is a particularly tough game, it really isn't, and is certainly a far cry from the brutality found in Zelda 2. But I do appreciate when a game isn't afraid to boost the difficulty in a sequel, rather than ease off the gas. Along with the fewer hearts, Link's Awakening contains fewer items. There is of course a sword and a shield, a feather allowing Link to jump again in both side-scrolling and overhead sections, a power bracelet for lifting items, Pegasus boots for attacking or breaking through designated blocks, the bow, which I never used, the hookshot, which is super effective on some enemies and allows for navigation over large pits, the magic rod, which is acquired so late it is only useful in one boss fight, the shovel used for digging, the magic powder, and lastly, the bombs. It is a streamlined item set, and outside of the bow, each item feels useful. I already talked about how the shield must be actively used to flip certain enemies, but I found myself using bombs as an offensive weapon in this game far more than any other. Perhaps this is because the player isn't initially limited to so few, but damn if these things don't make quick work of wizrobes. And of course, they are a versatile way to delay tripping a crystal switch. The magic powder retains utility outside of the raccoon sequence at the beginning of the game, by being needed on a boss, fully destroying the bubble, lighting lamps, and even paralyzing many enemies. The aforementioned Pegasus boots offer fast movement, are mandatory for clearing certain rocks, a form of progress gating, but are also a part of a puzzle unlocking the nightmare key in the 3rd dungeon, Key Cavern. The hookshot is an extremely versatile item, being a ranged offensive weapon, a boomerang for grabbing goodies, and of course allowing travel over large pits on designated areas. The power bracelet isn't just a means to lift objects, but is at times necessary for unlocking doors, and is required on an overworld puzzle needed to unlock the 7th dungeon, Eagle's Tower. I really dig how most items feel versatile and serve multiple functions, unlike say the hammer, which is needed in only a few specific instances and is rarely desired outside of these spots. Another awesome feature is both the A and B buttons are now customizable. Link does not have to wield the sword if the player would prefer a different weapon. Most famously, ditching the sword is required to beat the game, with the nifty Pegasus boots feather combo, allowing Link to jump over gaps 3 tiles long rather than 1. While I do not think there is some sort of floor or ceiling in terms of how many items or even power-ups a game should have, I especially appreciate when the items a game does have are thoughtful, balanced, and integrated into the game in meaningful ways, rather than one-off scenarios and never revisited again. This leads us to the boomerang boomerang. This is actually an incredibly obscure item and is not available to the player until after they complete the trade sequence, somewhere around halfway through the adventure, ending with the magnifying glass. The boomerang is not just used to stun enemies and grab rupees, but it is now an incredibly efficient offensive weapon. So powerful, in fact, it can kill the final form of the final boss in a single throw. This is the one instance where the items are not particularly balanced at all. Thankfully, in the non-DX version of Link's Awakening, there is no clue to the item's existence, and by the time the player finds the magnifying glass, they would never have reason to revisit the area containing the cave where the boomerang is obtained, but still. The magnifying lens also leads to the most cryptic element found in the entirety of the game. On my initial playthrough, I did not use a guide. I made it all the way to the egg and inside without any outside guidance. However, inside is a maze, which is 8 screens long. If my math is correct, there are over 65,000 possible combinations, meaning brute forcing one's way through this isn't really feasible. Instead, a player needs to find the exact path through here on the island of Koholint itself, but at some point the trade sequence stops becoming mandatory for progression, and it can be all too easy to forget about the scale in one's inventory, which is used on an obscure slice of Koholint Island. In 2 playthroughs of being diligent on listening to the owl's clues and visiting the phone booths, I can honestly say I don't recall an instance of the player being guided to finish the trade sequence to receive the key to the egg. In this instance, Link's Awakening is a little too cryptic. Thankfully, it is the only instance in the game where I find the mystery goes too far. With the boomerang and magnifying glass out of the way, the last 2 things to talk about are completely optional. Like Hyrule, Koholint Island is filled with heart pieces, with 4 equaling an entire heart container. It is optional and a good quest for completionist types or even those who might find the difficulty too much and want more heart containers. There's also a seashell side quest. Hidden on Koholint Island are 26 shells and a mysterious seashell mansion. These are hidden in some treasure chests and various areas on the island. Sometimes these are the only thing on a particular screen and are usually marked with some sort of hint. Again, some of that classic Zelda intuition. Collecting 20 will finally reveal a sword upgrade in the mansion. Like previous Zelda swords, this upgraded sword will fire a projectile if the player is at full health, which is pretty cool. The beefed up sword isn't mandatory by any stretch, as few enemies take more than 2 hits to go down, but it is a great reward for completing the side quest. This leads us to the ultimate end of Link's Awakening. Spoilers, Link is dreaming. Yeah, it is one of gaming's worst kept secrets. The entirety of the adventure is nothing but a dream, and beating the game will allow Link to awaken. The game is never subtle about it and is always dropping hints about what the ultimate conclusion will be. I often wonder if the developers assumed Game Boy gamers were younger than traditional console gamers, thus deciding to make the story less obscure, or if this was a deliberate storytelling decision to make the player feel angst as the adventure comes to a close. Does the player even want Link to wake up? The inhabitants of Koholint Island are quirky, strange, and wonderful, and it would be sad to see them go. And then, of course, there's Marin. She obviously has a crush on Link, but also doesn't need his help. She is not a damsel in distress needing to be rescued, but rather a love interest with more depth than the typical 90s game. A princess doesn't need to be rescued. Ganon doesn't need to be defeated. The only reason to collect the 8 instruments and wake the windfish is to escape the island. But if one doesn't need to leave the island, what is the point of trying to escape? It is a conundrum of sorts, and I think what will ultimately cement the game's legacy. It is non-traditional. The player is forced to beat the game because they want to, not because evil needs to be banished. In a way, it is subtly brilliant. And this is how I would ultimately describe Link's Awakening. The game could have easily been a watered-down A Link to the Past. There are certainly enough similarities here to see how this might have been the game's fate at one point, but it isn't watered down at all. Link's Awakening instead continued to push gaming forward, to push the Zelda franchise forward. The overworld feels thoughtful, deliberate, and interesting. There are bosses to fight, secrets to uncover, and puzzles. It isn't a vast space to travel looking for dungeons, but rather an engaging place to visit in its own right. Despite originally being a portable game, the dungeons are anything but bite-sized, but rather are large and complicated, battery-sucking affairs. They can be confusing, non-intuitive, difficult, misleading, and ultimately immensely rewarding once each is solved and conquered. And lastly, Koholint Island is filled with memorable characters. I generally don't really care about stories in video games, but Link's Awakening is different. The story unfolds slowly and all the way to the very end, constantly tormenting the player with the inevitable. Characters are unique and have personalities and actually move about the island, making Koholint Island feel more real even though it isn't. While the previous Zelda games have their own merits, none feel as complete, thoughtful, and polished as this Game Boy adventure. If one has only grown up on 3D Zelda, Link's Awakening would be my pick for the game to enter the world of classic 2D Zelda. It's a terrific title from beginning to end, with just a couple of minor flaws to speak of, and I find the gameplay and design to still feel fresh and relevant. And for these reasons, I ultimately find The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening to be a brilliant game.